Is there a place in time where logic breaks down and wonderment begins? Could that be somewhere at some time along an infinite line between the reasonable and the highly unlikely? Join us on a journey into the improbable.
Today's story, episode 256, Winner Take All, read by Ellen V. Hare, opening and closing theme by Matthew Erdman. Somewhere and sometime, losing might not be an option. Dr. Sadia Rahman met his potential investor in SBI Biotech's small reception area. He had started the lab with his own money, betting everything on his novel method for rapid development of hybrid organic silicon processors. But Sadia desperately needed capital. His visitor, a billionaire from Singapore known for making risky investments, was his last hope. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Khan," Sadia greeted, shaking Ching Lung's hand firmly before bowing slightly in accordance with Singaporean custom. "This way, please. I want to show you our lab." Sadia led the slight, well-groomed middle-aged man, dressed in a custom-tailored dark business suit, down a long hall. They exchanged polite small talk about the latest developments in the biotech sector until they stopped at a locked industrial-strength metal door. "We take security very seriously," Sadia explained. "The hall is lined with motion and heat sensors, as well as LiDAR. No one is going to steal our IP. Nothing gets in or out without our permission." When he entered a code on a keypad and placed his hand on the scanner next to it, the heavy door clicked open, letting in air from the hall. "It's negatively pressured," Sadia explained, pulling the door fully open. "There's nothing dangerous inside. We're leasing the lab from a medical research company. It's a level 3 facility. Not that we need it for the type of work we're doing here. I just got a good deal on the lease. Managing costs is always my top priority, so if you choose to invest, you can be assured we run a tight financial ship." Sadia beckoned Ching Lung into a small anteroom, where a second inner door on the opposite side was already standing open. "If we were working with pathogens, the inner door would have been closed," Sadia pointed out, then beckoned for Khan to follow him in. They entered a sterile, overlit room with gleaming surfaces made of polished steel and smooth white enamel. Exhaust hoods lined one wall. Under them sat a row of 8 high-tech incubators, where once there had been lab sinks. On the adjacent wall, 8 large flat-screen monitors had been installed, each displaying a game of Space Invaders. Several office desks had been moved in and occupied the center of the lab. At one sat a tall, lanky woman. She was wearing a lab coat over jeans and a t-shirt, and was watching the wall-mounted screens and making notes on a tablet. She looked up when Ching Lung and Sadia entered. "This is Dr. Amelia Walker, my partner and expert in synthetic biological intelligence," Sadia introduced, then added with a smile. "I lured her away from my Australian competition." He pointed to a row of incubators, "and those are our current crop of candidates. Although crop might be a misleading way to describe them. They're about as far from a plant as you can get." Sadia laughed nervously at his joke, motioning for Ching Lung to sit down at one of the open desks. As a matter of habit, the potential investor inspected the chair, brushing some unseen speck off before sitting and surveying the room. Sadia walked over to the incubator chambers and stood in front of number 3, placing his hand gently on its top. "This is our current leader," he said. "I'm sure you have lots of questions, Mr. Kong." Ching Lung watched the wall-mounted screens for a moment before answering. "So far, all I'm seeing is a bare-bones operation in an old leased lab with screens displaying an ancient video game. So tell me, what am I potentially investing in?" He leaned back in his chair, folded his hands in his lap, and waited. "Impress me," he added after a second. Sadia wondered how many times the man had been in this very situation, listening to a pitch from a desperate entrepreneur, and for the first time began to feel nervous. "Well, our long-term goal is to build the world's first generalized synthetic biological intelligence. But to get there, we need to develop the underlying hardware and patent it." As you know, for decades everyone has been trying to create a general intelligence based in software. And quite frankly, that will never happen. When you simulate weather patterns in a computer, it doesn't make it rain somewhere, does it? General intelligence is the same. You can write programs to simulate every brain function and still not create human-level cognition. Now we suspect intelligence is the product of underlying complexity. In other words, it's hardwired in, not a program running on top of the brain's pathways. This is why some of us are looking for biological solutions, and this is what you're investing in. Why try and reinvent intelligence? Why not use what nature has already created? Even fruit flies can navigate their own environment, which silicon-based AI self-driving cars still struggle to do, and that's after years of development and trillions of dollars. So, if you're looking for a fundamental building block for intelligence, it's the neuron. Other startups have been working to harness the neuron's ability to send and receive information, and have already shown their potential to work better than silicon. Using hybrid biosilicon processors, we'll be able to create general artificial intelligence, something silicon alone will never achieve. I'll let Dr. Walker explain the basic tech. Amelia typed on her keyboard, and the wall-mounted screens switched from displaying the game to an annotated diagram showing spidery neurons clinging to the surface of a silicon chip. The basics are pretty well established now, she began. We take embryonic brain cells grown from stem cells and isolate the neurons, then encourage them to grow over the surface of a micro multi-electrode array. The neurons self-organize and connect to it on their own. Once they've done that, the neurons will respond to electrophysiological input and feedback. Yes, I'm well aware of the basic technology, Dr. Walker. Ching Lung interrupted impatiently. What I want to know is why I should invest in you rather than one of the other larger labs working on this. That's easy, Sadia said, stepping away from the incubators to stand behind Amelia. All the other labs place these biosilicon systems in closed-loop and virtual environments, usually a simple game to stimulate growth and change. The theory is that the neurons want to create predictability by acting on their world. Simply put, they learn to play the virtual game they're receiving feedback from to control the environment they find themselves in. But we have upped the ante. Again, I already know this, Ching Lung complained. I can see the game you are having them play. So what? It's a bit more complex than the other labs, but basically the same principle. He pointed out and began to get up. Wait, no, you're right, sir, Sadia admitted anxiously. But we've added an element of competition to accelerate the development process. Khan stopped and sat back down. Tell me more. Amelia shot a disapproving glare at Sadia. He ignored her and raced to explain how they trained 8 separate neuron silicon test chips at a time by plugging them into individual virtual game environments. Then, at the end of a week, taking the one with the highest score, dividing its neurons into 8 and growing those samples onto 8 new multi-electrodes, increasing the density of the connections in each new generation. We can now grow and test a generation in just 7 days, Sadia boasted. The other labs take a month. We've almost caught up to the Australians, who were the first to enter the field. In another 2 generations, we'll surpass them in neuron and electrode density, learning speed, and task complexity. Chin Lung slowly smiled like a cat who had just found its prey. What's the neuron density you've achieved? He asked. Our current generation has about 3 million. Amelia replied before Sadia. The Australian labs are only at 4, Sadia added, and in our next generation we'll get to 5. I see, Chin Lung said, shifting slowly in his seat. I was in Beijing last week, at the National Center for Biotechnology. I heard about a biosilicon processor with 50 million neurons that the Chinese claim they will soon be able to train using Go. Deflated, Sadia collapsed into his chair beside Amelia. I wasn't aware of that, he admitted reluctantly. Few people are, Ching Lung noted. The Chinese government has been keeping it under wraps. I am fortunate to have close connections in Beijing who keep me up to date on new developments so I can make informed decisions. but it's not something I could invest in. The CCP doesn't need my money and will not sell the technology to a foreigner. My contact estimates they'll have commercially viable biochips in less than 18 months. Your progress is impressive, Dr. Raman, considering the short time you've been at this. But you need to step it up. Right now, in their isolated environments, the neuron cultures are not aware of each other, correct? That's right, Sadia confirmed. And as I understand it, the neurons have some form of inherent intelligence, Qinglong continued. So, like any living thing, they'll want to survive. Let them figure out the only way to do that is to become the top performer. Let them compete directly against each other. Do that, and I'll cover your operating costs for a month. And at the end of that time, if you can show me that you have made significant progress catching up to the Chinese, then I'll consider underwriting the rest of your development. Qinglong stood up, bowed slightly, and headed for the door. Sadia got up to show the investor out, but Qinglong motioned for him to stay put. I can find my own way out, thank you. I think you should spend your time trying to figure out how you're going to meet that deadline. Amelia waited until the investor was out of earshot. I know you need the money, Sadia, but I'm not sure about doing what he wants. Why? Sadia asked, already guessing what Amelia's objection would be. While she had played a key role in the early development of the micro-multi-electrode wafers that the neurons attached to, she had always advocated for caution. Because we don't understand what the neurons are doing or how they do it, she protested. We've always known there is some inherent sentience, that they're able to learn about their environment and alter it. But at what point does this cross the line into conscious intelligence? We have no idea, and therefore we won't know when that line has been crossed. So accelerating the process is I don't know. I'm just not comfortable with it until we understand more. I'm sympathetic, Sadia sighed. But we don't have an alternative. I'm out of money. We need an investor, and Qinglong Khan is the only person out there who is willing to take a chance on us. If you have an alternative, I'm ready to listen. Amelia didn't answer. Instead, she stared at the row of incubators, thinking. Sadia sighed again. Oh, come on. You don't really believe they're doing anything more than bacteria do. Both react to stimulus from their environment. It's the most basic form of interaction. It's not conscious intention. We're dealing with new responses formed by new stimulus. The cells that react better gain an evolutionary advantage and pass the behavior along. All we'll be doing is speeding the process up. Qinglong is right. Expanding their virtual world to include direct competition will stimulate change. I should have thought of that before. So we're moving from the barely understood into the totally unknown, Amelia objected. They are living cells and— Okay, I get it, Sadia conceded grudgingly. But this is my call and we're going ahead. If it will make you feel any better, I'll be the one disposing of the losers. I just need you to add the networking capacity to the training environments. The following day, Sadia was late arriving at the lab. Qinglong's lawyers had sent him a thick stack of documents to sign, and it had taken all morning and part of the afternoon to go through them with his own legal counsel. When he finally arrived, Amelia was at her desk, watching a temporary monitor she had wheeled over beside the 8 wall-mounted screens. A list ranked top to bottom was displayed, along with a number corresponding to the score generated by each of the associated neuron cultures. Thanks for getting this going, Sadia said. That's what you wanted, wasn't it? I'm going out for lunch, Amelia explained curtly. The program is open on your workstation. All you have to do is click start. Sadia watched her leave, trusting that she would eventually come around. The fact she had made the alterations at all told him she just needed time to process things. Sadia sat down and moved the mouse to wake up his desktop, then looked over at the output screens on the far wall as he waited for the machine to come back to life. He found himself mesmerized by the little pixelated spaceships, silently advancing down the screens in rows, dropping jagged energy bolts as they went. The neurons on the biochips methodically moved the crude green laser cannons back and forth along the bottom of each screen, dodging the energy bolts while shooting up through depleting barriers at the relentless alien spaceships. If the game resulted in an all-time high score, the neurons were stimulated with a bit of electric current. The more frequent the high score, the more current they received. Stimulus and response. It was simple. No conscious intelligence was involved. Sadia tried to assure himself. And yet, there were unanswered questions. He knew it was the use of human neurons that had encouraged the wild and unfounded speculation about the inadvertent creation of consciousness, and why Amelia sometimes struggled with the ethics of their work. He had to admit that he did have some reservations as well. But after dumping everything he owned into SBI Biotech, he needed to keep going, and he needed to be the first to market if he wanted to avoid personal bankruptcy. He briefly imagined life in a universe consisting of one game, before chastising himself for being so influenced by Amelia's arguments. He shook off the thought and shifted his gaze to the desktop screen, then moved the mouse over to the start button and clicked. The 8 wall-mounted screens briefly glitched, but when they came back on, nothing appeared to have changed. Sadia let out a breath he hadn't realized he had been holding, then turned his attention to a growing queue of messages he had been ignoring. "I see you started the new program," Amelia said. Sadia jumped, realizing he had lost track of time. Looking up from his computer screen, he saw that Amelia was watching the display screens with a keen eye. "When did you switch them over?" She nodded at the incubators. "Just after you left. Why?" "Have you been monitoring their reaction?" "No. I got caught up in correspondence," Sadia admitted, then squinted at the wall screens. Everything looks okay to me. I wouldn't expect any real change until we're a few more generations down," he added. "And I've been thinking about that. If we keep on the current schedule, we'll only get 4 more generations in before Qinlong's deadline. I don't think that's enough to show significant progress. We need to speed things up. We'll use the leader to culture a new generation at the end of each day and dispose of the others." "I think that's too aggressive. It doesn't give us time to analyze results," Amelia pointed out. "Come on, it's simple. What's there to analyze?" Sadia objected. "The leader moves on." "But shouldn't we try to figure out why some are coming out on top? Really, Sadia, we should be studying and documenting how the neuron cultures are adapting to the new environment." Sadia shook his head. "Sorry, that kind of analysis will have to wait until we secure Mr. Khan's support." "So you really haven't noticed?" Amelia accused, stubbornly squaring her shoulders. When Sadia just stared at her blankly, she pushed on. "The top scores. They're all going up after each game. That's never happened before, and I swear if you watch the movement of the laser cannons, they all appear to be using the same tactics now. I think they're watching each other play and sharing the most successful tactics. In other words, they're cooperating. Now, since they're connected, they're forming a more complex structure. We really need to study this." "If true, that's interesting," Sadia grudgingly acknowledged. "But confirming it would mean stopping to study the phenomena, and as I've already said, we don't have time. Besides, how do you know it's just not confirmation bias and you're seeing patterns that are not there? Personally, I don't see anything." "Maybe you're the one that's only seeing what they want to," Amelia shot back. "I think you should take the rest of the day off," Sadia said in a tone which implied it was more than a suggestion. "Come back in tomorrow and we'll take a more objective look. You can run the data mining package on the gameplay and see if any patterns show up. Regardless, we're not slowing down." Sadia watched her leave in a huff, then turned back to his work. He decided he was going to stay all night so he could get the next generation in place before she came back. Amelia found him asleep in his chair when she arrived the next morning. The first thing she noticed was the generation numbers had been changed on the incubators. "Damn him," she cursed. He had gone ahead despite her objections with the accelerated timeline. Now, even if analysis hinted at cooperation between the neuron cultures, there would be no way to repeat the process to confirm it. Sadhya, wake up," she growled. He shifted in his chair, trying to roll on his side, then woke with a start. Did I doze off?" "Yes," Amelia replied. "I thought you were going to let me run the data before you moved on." "Run the stats if you want," Sadhya dismissed with a yawn. "I stayed here last night to cultivate the next generation. The new neurons will have integrated well enough with the multi-electrode arrays by this afternoon to be placed back into the gaming environment. This time we'll run it for 12 hours, then do it again. At that pace, we can advance almost 5 generations in 7 days, and we'll be able to beat Qinlong's deadline by a week or more." They argued about the process until Sadhya and Amelia finally agreed that she would focus on data analysis off-site until the funding was finally secured. After that, Sadhya agreed to slow the process down so they had time to study the neurons' behavior. Amelia had been working at home for over 2 weeks when the breakthrough occurred. Other than getting the results from each new generation, she had little direct contact with Sadhya, who appeared to be living in the lab. For days he had ignored her flurry of emails insisting he look at the analysis, which showed the gameplay across the competing biochips was being coordinated. Finally, in the most recent generation, there had been no winner at all. The neuron cultures had cooperated so all would survive. Amelia was concerned about the implications and needed to convince Sadhya to stop until they figured out what was going on, so she broke their agreement and headed to the lab. As she hurried past the SBI reception desk, the usually quiet attendant tried to stop her. "Dr. Walker, you can't go into the lab right now." "Why?" Amelia demanded. "Dr. Raman is in there doing a demonstration for Mr. Kong." "Kong?" Amelia said in surprise, feeling a flash of anger. "Sadhya didn't say anything to me about that." "Mr. Kong flew in this morning," the receptionist said. "It was all very sudden. I'm sure Dr. Raman intended to tell you, but he was very excited about something yesterday. It must have slipped his mind." "I doubt that," Amelia growled, angry that Sadhya had cut her out of a critical meeting. When she got to the lab's entrance, she impatiently keyed in her code. The thick door seemed somehow slower to open than normal. Finally, it unsealed, and Amelia slipped by it into the anteroom. She found the interior door closed and electronically locked from the inside, and pushed her face to the glass to look in. Sadhya and Qinlong were seated, consumed by a game of Space Invaders on the desktop computers. Both were sweating, making Amelia suspect the ventilation system had been shut off. That's when she noticed the red flashing light indicating the lab had been locked down. Air would be prevented from entering or exiting. The room was completely sealed. She remembered they had the emergency system disabled to prevent this exact situation from accidentally happening. How had it been turned back on, she wondered. They had also taken out the emergency air supply to make room for the monitors. Amelia felt fear grow in her stomach. She angled her view so she could see more and banged on the thick glass window, but neither man turned away from their computers. She banged again, then noticed on the monitor wall there were 3 active screens, labeled players 1 to 8, A and B. The temporary leaderboard she had set up showed the rankings. Players 1 to 8 were so far ahead of A and B it was laughable. Below the rankings, in blocky white letters was written, "Now we all play, winner take all." And below that was a red graph tracing the falling oxygen levels in the lab. Amelia pounded on the glass until Sadhya risked a glance at her and mouthed, "Help us." Immediately, player B fell to last place, and Sadhya turned back to his screen with renewed desperation. Makeshift Stories is a proud member of the Alberta Podcast Network, locally grown, community supported. To get other great APN podcasts, head over to albertapodcastnetwork.com, where you'll find Quantum Kickflip. Join 6 Edmonton comedians as they play Slug Blaster, a sci-fi tabletop role-playing game developed in Alberta. This episode of Makeshift Stories is brought to you by Taproot Spotlight, a service that helps businesses and organizations pay attention to the people they serve. Taproot tells you the news about the people and companies that are important to you. Use that information internally to keep everyone on the same page, or share it with the world in your newsletter, on your website, and on your social media channels. Find out more at taprootpublishing.ca/spotlight. That's taprootpublishing.ca/spotlight. This episode of Makeshift Stories is also brought to you by the Alberta Podcast Network. The Alberta Podcast Network builds audiences for Alberta-made podcasts and connects those listeners to Alberta-based businesses, organizations, and community partners. Smart, creative, and engaging podcasters in our network provide an excellent opportunity to reach listeners who are interested in local topics, as well as those around the world who enjoy our shows. Our roster of podcasts includes shows about business, the arts, sports, politics, movies, self-improvement, technology, fiction, and more. Let the Alberta Podcast Network put together a great campaign for you. Get in touch at hello@albertapodcastnetwork.com. Makeshift Stories is released around the beginning and the middle of the month. This month's story was written and read by Ellen V. Hare. Opening and closing themes composed and recorded by Matthew Erdman. Audio production and editing by Makeshift Studios. If you'd like to connect with us, please send an email to makeshiftstories@gmail.com or visit our website at makeshiftstories.com. Links to both are in the show notes. You can help us out by getting your friends to subscribe or follow wherever they listen to audio. Makeshift Stories is released under a Creative Commons non-commercial attribution, no derivative license, which means that you're free to share our stories. Just remember to credit us and don't alter anything.